Okay. Well, welcome. We're on time, more or less. Welcome to Wednesday office hours. This will, of course, be another tedious time with me. And the advantage, of course, being on YouTube, that you should be able to take the recording and speed it up or report it or something else. Okay. Let's begin at the beginning. Today, we're going to continue on looking at quantum political economy, and uh, I'm beginning the process of trying to write this and make it coherent. So we'll see some of that in a moment. That's at the top of the file. At the end of the file, and like my other little yammerings, I tend to sort of start with the last thing first, and I will remind you that it's possible to consider this particular example. Okay, so circuits of capital, and they're interlocking, overlapping, and in some ways is where we begin with our millefeuille, that is a thousand-layer cake, a Napoleon, if you will, or baklava, however you want to think about it, baklava, whatever. Um, and the idea is that you have in the basic Marxian equation um, multiple circuits implied, and the difference between Department 1 and Department 2, that is production and distribution consumption, is that there are interlocking components that are defined by circuits. And of course, a circuit is not a linear form, right? It has a certain spatial element to it, just as even as a model. So originally, going back to Harvey and et al., Cleaver et al., if you've been following along, there are in this model 4 circuits, or this example 4 circuits: circuit of commodity capital, the circuit of productive capital, the circuit of advanced capital, which is an interesting problem in and of itself, and of course, the circuit of money capital. Now, the problem, of course, is where do all these things fit? For some Marxian models, money is, sort of not as fully integrated, even though there is money, there's the money commodity, et cetera, et cetera. But there, there is a whole set of additional issues that are brought up by classical political economy, as well as modern neoclassical political economy. And so, without going into a whole deal about that, the point is that it's a little more complicated. Um, Money is a problematic element to some people's theories. Um, and I will try not to exclude it as we move further on here. But anyways, I thought I would give you an example of where we sort of started with all this, and get back to our back to the main deal here. All righty. So essentially, and I'll go to the end in a second, this latest thinking about the deep structure of capital, because that's kind of what is implied by that little multi-layered thing I just showed you of circuits, and addressing those heterodox political economy questions which study this is for the quantum sort of fiddling around, econophysics, which has its own set of elements and adherents and other folks who fiddle around with it, and some of whom would disavow the physics element or claim that it's only about mechanics and blah, 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 blah. We won't go there. But suffice to say that there are several ways in which you could look at econophysics, and one way, particularly in a more quote unquote modern way or more contemporary way, would be to think about from the last couple of decades at least, is quantum ideas. Now, I'm not reducing everything to quantum theories or whatever, quantum behaviors or whatever, that we're just still starting constructing a way in which we can think about capital as obviously multidimensional, obviously as uh, having a variety of indeterminacies, obviously playing with uncertainty, non-linear or anti-linear, or a variety of other things that are going to be problematic when we move further on about, Volta and Marx, etc. So that's where we sort of begin. That is a model of a modern or current model of capital that appreciates the fact that after the Great Recession of 2007, 2008, we're in a very different place. The economy is in a different place, and then there are the usual suspects who are screwing around with the economy as it is. So there's that. So let me go to the end here. And yes, there's a lot of crap here. A couple of interesting articles. An interesting article that I think meets the needs of our sort of mathematical stuff, but doesn't explicitly talk about it in those ways. And we'll get to that at probably by the end. You'll see sort of why we're doing it that way. But anyway, so to the end. I put a lot of extraneous stuff in here about questions about rents and rentier, et cetera, and that's kind of where we're going to head at the front end, or eventually. Let's put it that way. So there's this little review, an article, The Euphoria of the Renter, Javier Moreno Zacaris, from 2021. And so this gives us our kind of opening frame. That is, notwithstanding the cyclical downturns and occasional depressions, it is customary to speak of capitalist development as a dynamic of self-expanding growth. Since the 1970s, however, stagnation has set in on a global scale amid falling profitability in the sphere of commodity production. The relocation of the world's manufacturing base to low-wage economies has failed to offset this process. On the contrary, late industrializers have compressed the productivity gains of their predecessors into ever shorter growth cycles, recreating their problems in an accelerated fashion. Now, in the meantime, capital has turned to speculative ventures, promising better returns. See crypto, for example. The result has been a pattern of weak growth, sustained by financial bubbles, and yes, there's some now, leaving a trail of destructive crashes and jobless recoveries in the buildup to the Great Recession. That is 2007, 2008. Now, in the decade plus since 2009, the central banks of the rich world have blanketed their anemic economies with money, but to no avail. As growth fails to pick up, and yes, we're currently at a kind of stagnation element, and it's bounded by inflation, et cetera, stagflation, et cetera. The wealthy are abdicating their investment duties, parking their capital. Now, this is one element of it: parking their capital in government bonds, regardless of negative interest rates. The owners of capital are now literally paying states to take their money. Now, that's only one aspect of the element. So let's move past that. The point of all this is to explain or to introduce financialization, that is, finance capital amok, whatever. Though the story of secular stagnation is by now familiar, considerable debates continue to surround it. First, there are competing ways of conceptualizing the present stage of capitalist development. Conceptual trends have varied over the decades. That is, late capitalism, post-Fordism, cognitive capitalism. These are all jargonish in that sense, but you could call the era late capitalism. You can some of the industrial, the production side components of it as Fordist or post-Fordist, or the movement from Fordism to post-Fordism. Now, the point, of course, is that one doesn't displace the other. There's still people laboring in factories somewhere, putting things together and making things. So there is no post-Fordism in that particular sense. It's just simply, as they say, as I would say, layered on top of that. So the whole thing about uneven development. Anyway, and then the third element, cognitive capitalism, which is kind of where we are. The things that we've been worrying about or that we're fiddling around with. That's why there's an interest in rent, an interest in rentiers, among other things that are part of cognitive capitalism, attention, et cetera, et cetera. However, the term that has risen to dominance over the past 15 years plus or so is financialization, a concept that highlights the growing salience of finance, insurance, and real estate in the world economy at the expense of manufacturing. Now, without trying to explain this author's, point of view on this, the point is that you have these things, the FIRE, finance, insurance, real estate, FIRE, FIRE, that it's fire sale in that sense. The financialization dominates these sorts of things, and you can see obviously that there are people who exploit that position. Like Trump trying to get all of the wealth he can before he croaks. Because in some ways he has an obligation to his family. On the other hand, it's just simply a matter of building whatever that thing is, that monument to himself, that he sort of doesn't realize that we're going to disassemble all of that. It is, a pariah economy. But anyway, that's another story. Second, the underlying causes of this rise of financialized capitalism are a matter of dispute. Some see stagnation as a consequence of neoliberal restructuring in the wake of the stagflation crisis of the 1970s. We're back at a stagflation crisis. It's looming. Now, according to this view, neoliberalism empowered short-sighted financiers with their speculative interests, stunting capitalism's productive dynamism in the process. Others argue that capitalism peaked with the golden age of the post-war boom. In other words, since the Korean War, stuff is not as good for all kinds of reasons. The argument about taxing the rich, et cetera, the corporate tax rate, blah blah blah. As intense international competition gave way to thinning profitability and secular stagnation, leading to an outgrowth of excess capital in the form of finance. Now, we're not making this stuff up. This happened. And you can see all of its manifestations, the conversion of the British economy, the growth of globalization, the lost decade in Japan, blah, 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 blah. The dot-com crisis, blah, blah. There is a third debate lurking beneath the surface, one that has not yet begun in earnest, but that is drawing increasing attention. And this is of interest to socialists, of course, or democratic socialists, the question of whether we are witnessing a transition out of capitalism. Now, there are people running around who still, like Trump, who believe in trickle down. He never says that, but in fact, everything that he talks about is, in terms of his narcissism, is that building his wealth, something will eventually make other people wealthy. That's his whole positive, thing about the world. And which is, well, anyway, there's a whole story there, and not for me to talk about now. So back to the text. Immanuel Wallerstein saw financialization as the twilight of the capitalist world system, with the Great Recession signaling its irreversible demise. It may still have done that. And we're still in an interesting period. At the time, Wallerstein prophesied that we will be certain that we will be not living in the capitalist world system in 30 years. Now, that's an interesting question, and things are changing, crypto, etc. So, something could change. The new social system that will come out of this crisis will be substantially different. Now, what might it be, however? Political question, and thus open-ended. Most theorists are, for good reason, less confident in making predictions with such astronomical precision, but this has not a number of voices from raising the possibility of capitalism as we know it maybe warping into something else. Now, people need to sell books and, get their brand out there and do other stuff. So, we could talk about techno-feudalism, all kinds of other stuff, and that's fine. There are different ways of framing the problem, but the problem is still there. Something is changing, could be substantially different in a bad way. We could all wind up, with all due respect in terms of dystopias, all wind up in a George Miller film, Mad Max, etc. Which, at one level, what some people would like. Freedom City is also, another person's gas town, if you follow the Mad Max stuff. So, for classical political economists, capitalism was defined by a pattern of self-sustaining growth driven by market competition. So we'll come back to this. Competition compels producers to maximize the cost efficiency of their operations, typically with labor-saving means, resulting in a systematic expansion of output that cheapens the price of commodities. Now, this is what Marxists have long called the law of value. If such a dynamic is what distinguishes capitalism from other modes of production, noting that there are 4 or 5 historical modes of production that have that are marked by a variety of crises, primitive communism, slavery, feudalism, capitalism, and then if you believe the model, socialism, then communism, in other words, back to a thing that eliminates all the trouble that was in during the middle period, property exploitation, war, deprivation, all those things. Now, if such a dynamic is what distinguishes capitalism from other modes of production, then we need to confront the fact that the capitalist world economy seems to be transforming into the mirror image of this. Now, with growth slowing down to a trickle, it is slowing. So, we don't have to get into a big thing on that. And productivity stagnating, that is happening. It appears that accumulation, that is capital accumulation, is now less about making anything and more about simply owning something. Now, this is a simple, perhaps a too simple and false, perhaps, dichotomy. But this idea of making versus owning is, kind of the crux of many different problems. And you can see this in a variety of ways, patent control, intellectual property, blah, 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 blah. Profit making is increasingly about cornering scarce assets in order to drive up their price. Now, this is also controversial and problematic, but it is a practice that the classics called rent, in which they identify not with capitalists, but with landlords. Now, this is where, the story is going to move, and this is why I've been interested in rent, among other things, in terms of what we will get to hopefully by the end of today, and that is fictitious capital. And to speak personally, just briefly for a moment here, I've been pursuing this idea for decades. Uh, the entry point for me was David Harvey's work talking about fictitious capital, but my point was that was fine. It is an element, and you need to talk about it in terms of spatiotemporal stuff, blah 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 blah. But what it didn't have, and which is what we're doing now here, is to give it uh, a more quantitative character, um, taking advantage, I think, of some things that have changed in the several decades. Now that David Harvey is towards the end of his life, as am I. But we need to sort of reconcile certain kinds of ideas and get them sort of down on paper. Now, I make no pretension to um, uh, uh, output, literature output like David Harvey. But the point I want to make here is that we can take certain ideas that are there, they've been there, they are in effect classical ideas, they just haven't been fully articulated. And we're going to look at a author by the name of Durand and a bunch of other folks uh, who are asking questions about value and using things like fictitious capital and rent to assess or challenge or analyze the system of crises under which we operate. And yes, there are crises. It's just that our big problem is trying to figure out, why is it that we don't notice it until it's already upon us, or that we can't predict it, or all those other, kind of things. Back to the text. As rentierism, we'll talk more about rentiers. And rentiers is an old term. It's not a new term. It is about a certain class, and we're now back to class. And the prior paragraph, is difference between capitalists and landlords is not that broad, considering that you have realtors doing our diplomatic policy in the U.S. So, as rentierism takes over, it appears that capitalism's distinct forms of surplus extraction organized around the impersonal pressures of the world market are giving way to juridico political forms of exploitation. That is, fees, leases, and politically sustained capital gains. And this is, where the crux of where everything is now, a attention, subscription-based, information-driven, blah, blah, blah economy, a cognitive capitalism, if you will. So we have to go back to certain key, portions of the literature, the late David Graeber to Robert Brenner, who's still alive, authoritative theorists of capitalism with opposing ideas for its origins and developer now converging on the view that contemporary patterns of class domination look increasingly non-capitalist. Now, that's a whole thing we could, deal with. Whether it is or isn't capitalist is, not really our worry here. We're just looking at the kind of the multiplicity of these framing of these ideas. So, for example, and I'll pose this as a rhetorical question at the moment, if we can have a gift of nature, can we have, a gift of culture? Now that implies all kinds of other things, but it's kind of an interesting question because in some ways it reflects, ecologically speaking, on the difference between the Anthropocene and the Capitalocene and blah, blah, blah. So we'll pursue that in a further moment. So for Mackenzie Wark, this warrants the provocative question: is it something worse? That is the next thing that is non-capitalist, etc. Now, Wark, has a whole other set of things that she's dealing with, and I'm not going to go there. Although it's very interesting to read, but whatever. And so we'll move further on here. And in fact, it's sort of, you know, egregious that the author put this in here. But anyway, in a masterful study, we'll come back to this. Brett Christopher's work casts light on contemporary capitalist dynamics by reforming the concept of rentierism. So we have a revision, a reframing, a new neologism in that sense. And so let's look at a preliminary description of what this might be. Rentier capitalism defines rent as payment to an economic actor, that is a rentier, purely by virtue of controlling something valuable. Now, in an earlier period, this is about, class distinctions, the ruling class, that nothing is shared, there's no taxation, or taxation is framed in a different way, et cetera, et cetera. Rent-bearing assets can be physical, like enclosed natural resources, or a piece of the built environment, or they can be purely legal entities like intellectual property. So we've already covered, the range of our multiple layers, right? The point is to secure income derived from ownership, possession, or control of scarce assets under conditions of limited or no competition. So there's a bunch of things implied by the one sentence that include, cartelization, oligopoly, industry concentration, blah, 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 blah. So there's a lot to unpack, as they say. But back to Brett Christopher's, who's written some of the most interesting work on this, but with all due respect, he's coming at it from a certain point of view, which is an important point of view. That is geography, economic geography, as it were. But I would assert to you that spatiotemporal information science has changed the nature of what counts as economic geography or financial geography or all those other things, and we need to sort of assess them in a much broader and fully integrated way. And yes, it's more tedious. It requires armies of graduate students and blah, blah, blah. And probably the worst time, since graduate admissions or graduate enrollments are dropping anywhere from 5 to 10% as of today. And it's going to be more problematic only simply because, fascists are in charge. But anyway, Christophers describes this as a system of the views of classical political economists who saw rent as monopoly profits derived from the objective scarcity of an asset with those of orthodox economists, and this is the division of classical political economists and orthodox economists, who are not identical, even though one gives more lip service to the other, and then the other is more about neoclassical economics, etc. And so that's, there's a lot there. Who describe as rent, quote unquote, all excess profits made from stunted competition, as such as through regulatory capture. Lest you think that's unimportant, it's why the U.S. has, cabinet members who are members of, who are billionaires, corporate boards, and, all that other stuff. It's unfortunate, but in the United States, that's kind of comes to the territory, and it's no different regardless of your political affiliations. Now, the contradistinction is somewhat of a caricature. Was Marx, for example, unaware that ground rent arises out of enclosure and not just sheer scarcity of land? Now, you can pursue that in a whole bunch of different ways, but we're not going to do that. Yet, Brett Christopher's redefinition of rent injects a remarkable dose of clarity into an otherwise obscure and intricate topic, which is kind of our, bread and butter, as they say. One until recently confined to, yes, there's a whole field called critical geography, and it has a whole other set of things that come with it. And it's evolved from a certain body of literature that, on the one hand, was reactionary relative to geographic information systems and a whole bunch of other things. And of course, the fracture between among geographies, that is physical versus cultural and blah, 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 blah. So, but it is, as pointed out here, is Christopher's disciplinary home. as opposed to those of us who are disciplinary homeless or unhoused. So for Christopher's, capitalism in its current stage is not just dominated by rent and rentiers. It is also, quote, in a much more profound sense, substantially scaffolded by and organized around the assets that generate those rents and sustain those rentiers. So it's contextual, environmental, ecological, contextual, etc. In other words, we are living in a fully fledged rentier capitalism, a mode of economic organization in which success is based principally, you can see this, you just walk out the door, principally on what you control, not what you do. So the balance sheet is the be all and the end all, and yeah, sure, blah, 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 accountants and suits and blah, blah. The days of creative destruction are long gone. Now, that's controversial, and I would assert to you that creative destruction is still there. It's perhaps modified. Now, this variant of capitalism is structured around, as was pointed out earlier, having or owning rather than producing or making. It is pervaded by a proprietorial rather than entrepreneurial ethos. Now, even that phrase is not fully, explicated, but anyway, in which the pace of societal reproduction is no longer set by fierce competition in the sphere of commodity production, but by securing, protecting, and sweating scarce assets. Note, of course, the scarcity problem is a big one and argued at various levels relative to utility and et cetera, et cetera. That we went through decades of modeling scarcity when in fact nothing was scarce. It's just a position that is necessary in order to motivate a series of theoretical arguments, but that's another story. This carries inherently, and you can see it in front of you, monopolistic tendencies which are generally generally inimical to dynamism and innovation. As a safety of rentierism, disincentives productivity, enhancing investments. Now, this is the sort of underlying thing here is that, yeah, parasitism, parasites, don't help growth. Well, yes and no. And even in nature, that's an issue. On the other hand, there's a whole bunch of, sort of zombified examples in the animal kingdom, anyway, or the insect kingdom, even. So for Christopher's, the term rentierization captures better the stagnant state of contemporary capitalism than financialization, which focuses on the redirection of economic activities towards financial channels. So what you see here is that rentierization is this sort of bigger category and is more, is a better collective or collecting or covering term that because people will automatically reduce financialization down to certain things, industries, products, blah, 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 and assume that it has nothing to do with, labor, nature, culture, etc. Rentierization gives us an entry point in that, to use the Rick Wolf thing, a better entry point to sort of understanding the nature of political economy, economics, etc. And also the underlying structure of things, which are, kind of important for our other little quantum thing. So the latter privileges one strand of a broader structural transformation and ignores all of the others, several of which data suggest have been just as materially significant as the expansion of finance, if not more so. Now, this is GIGO, right? Sometimes, even with big data, you can be misled. So as Christopher's taxonomizes in the book, contemporary rentierism is a highly complex and multifaceted phenomenon. So if the rentier of the 19th century was predominantly a financier or landlord, the rentiers of today also derive income streams from, yes, this is cognitive capitalism, digital platforms, natural resource reserves, intellectual property, service contracts, or infrastructure. That's all of the things that, we were yammering about before, in a variety of ways. So the empirical focus of the book, that is Brett Christopher's book, is on, of course, neoliberal Britain, the rentier economy par excellence. This is what I was referring to before about the shift to, more. It's kind of what Brexit was about, the service economies, the financialized stuff. But it's bigger than that, as was Brexit. So, across 7 chapters, brimming with useful data, Christopher explores the different types of rentier that have flourished since the 1970s, charting their weight in the economy as well as the institutional transformation that they're being. So we can go through the whole business. Margaret Thatcher's privatization of public assets, no different than the current privatization mania that is going on in our central government. State-owned companies, buildings, land, birth infrastructure rentiers, and swelled the ranks of land rentiers, and we actually have that here, while the spread of public contracts due to outsourcing gave rise to service contract rentiers, a whole possibility, a whole bunch of things to unpack there. The liberalization of finance and falling interest rates enabled a surge in interest-bearing household, corporate, and sovereign debt. It's kind of what Trump's all about, that boosted the power of financial rentiers. Trumpism is built on this, and of course, manipulating the state to do that. He doesn't believe in free enterprise. He believes in using the state to, make him rich. It's not about free markets, needless to say. The exploitation of oil reserves in the North Sea and the invention of digital platform technologies expanded the pool of natural resource and digital rents. Kind of that's what I've been fiddling with in a variety of ways. Rent is our entry point as well. So in turn, the fortification of property rights buttressed rentierism as a whole, as did the long-term neutralization of competition law and a growing leniency towards monopoly practices. We're currently doing that now. Fiscal policy was also key, particularly the weakening of capital gains tax, which released fiscal pressure on the gains occurring upon asset disposal, allowing asset prices increases to grow unchecked. Lest you think that's not important, it's why we have a Power 4 configuration in college sports in the United States rather than Power 5 plus 1, which is where it was a decade ago. Anyway, as such, neoliberalism did not just support the incomes of rentiers, but also the value of rentier assets themselves. The exorbitant monopoly profits afforded by rentierism redirected capital towards low productivity sectors, resulting in a stagnant economy, that where we're headed currently. Due to the disarticulation of working class organizations, see attacks on labor unions, is also marked by growing inequality. And it's not simply about working class organizations, but growing inequality has race and class implications, gender, et cetera, et cetera. Underpinning this social formation is a tacit class alliance between large corporations and petty rentiers. See, Trump is not a large corporation, a corporate structure, but he's really a petty rentier, and he's always been that. He just indulges himself with, golf, etc., and he's just a, indulgent rich kid who's never really grown up. So that's kind of where we are. The White House has an inner child in that sense. Homeowners anxious about house price increases and comfortable telegraph reading. Telegraph is the
also functions like a mob boss.
Oh, indeed.
Mob boss.
Reading retirees relying on pension fund income. So that's the end of this little article. It is in the New Left Review of May to June 2021. Javier Moreno Zacaras, Euphoria of the Rentier ? So I'm reading this article, which is at the end of what I'm going to talk about at the front end, but this is kind of my normal pattern, is that I frame the argument so that when you go to the front end, hopefully you'll have this kind of context to work from. So it's like reading the footnotes first, or the end notes first. So here we go. We begin with my fiddling around with certain ideas. The latest thinking, to return to this little first paragraph, latest think about the deep structure of capital and addressing those heterodox political economy questions which study econophysics. That it's a neologism, but it's there. It even has a Wikipedia page. Foundation is classical political economy rather than the neoclassical orthodoxy. And that's the kind of, and without getting into the arguments, we're going to get there in a moment, but economics has this whole set of things that's problematic. Western, so-called Western economists, don't really respect, for example, Asian economists for a variety of reasons. It's not like they, act as biased. It may simply be a language problem, but it's sort of an interesting way in which you can view the field, among other things. Anyway, second paragraph. Financialized capital's greater prominence in 21st century crises suggests the limitations of orthodox theories represented by economic neoclassicism. They don't refer to it as neoclassicism, but I like it because it borrows from the art historical. But anyway, especially as they relate to quantum political economy. Advanced quantitative methods are available for developing what classical political economy first called, and this is why the Cedric Durand book is really important. And it's unfortunate that it took me years, several years, to get around to reading the damn thing, because it's what I really sort of wanted to do, but there was no I wasn't compelled at the moment to do it, but now sort of I am for a variety of reasons. Anyway, the point. Fictitious capital will be important. Let's put it that way. Durand's book is on fictitious capital, but in a certain point of view, and it builds on certain post-regulatory school French economists, but that's another story. Capitalization turns a future right into a present asset. Now, that may seem pretty obvious to the normal capitalists and people who, do it for a living, but it actually is an important idea because it actually affects all kinds of other stupid things, as I tried to suggest last week. Now, how does the creation of fictitious capital work? There's, we go back to David Harvey, etc., but this has its roots, if you're reading Durand, back to the beginnings of classical political economy. So, but from a terminological point of view, we want to talk about capitalization. So what Durand says is the formation of fictitious capital is known as capitalization. And in fact, that's kind of it's not a new definition. It is kind of what goes on in capitalizing things, or in terms of creating capitalization, because it is about present assets and sort of the path of future rights, etc. And you can see why that interests me in terms of transfer development rights, rents, etc. Even defining rent as capital, that's problematic for some people. It isn't problematic in the big picture, but to other people, they really don't want to think of it that way. But in fact, that's kind of what it is. And it is, and I don't, it's not anything I'm imposing on this. I think this is when you get down to the accounting of it or the tax implications, it's kind of where it goes. Fictitious capital preempts the future valorization process, even as it makes it invisible. So already we have, a problem of, it's an ideographic problem. That is, you're talking about things that are not, sort of epiphenomenal or rules or laws, but rather something that's kind of palpable that you can sort of, see and then it not see. So in earlier centuries, it was called, or one way in which you can refer to it as, and this is in the 19th century, the circulation of inauthentic capital. Now, of course, that raises the question of what counts as authentic capital and whatever, but that's another story. There is a corresponding, or this is the research question I'm posing, there is a corresponding gifts of capital that is asymmetric, not identical, it's not a substitute, and it doesn't displace it, but there's something. It's asymmetric to the gifts of nature. And of course, I was talking about what's her name last week, her book on the gifts of nature, and so that's kind of an interesting metaphorical way in which we can approach the problem. But as I said, I'm less concerned about the way in which we approach the problem in a literary way to the more literal questions or the empirical questions that have to do with, measurement and money and other stuff. So, do present financial profits sustain the value of accumulated fictitious capital? That's a big question. As if the promises made today can only be accepted if past ones have been kept. And that's the whole problem of Trump, is that he's such a psychotic that he doesn't really, care about those kind of things. It doesn't matter to him as long as he's, indulging himself, whatever. The state and this is the other point that is a key point. It's not to ignore the role of the state. It is the way in which we could talk about a variety of economic approaches, including, Minsky, Kalecki, Keynes, and all, other things that will impinge on the problem. So the state is a major facilitator of the ever increasing rent-seeking practices of oligopolistic capital. And lest you think that's unimportant, it's kind of why there's a Russia-Ukraine war at the present moment, or currently an Iranian-U.S. war that is actually starting up again, which is horrible, but whatever. Anyway, and so this is a quote from the review, and I won't rehearse it, but the rentiers of today also derive income streams from digital platforms, natural resource reserves, intellectual property, service contracts, or infrastructure. And it's kind of what's going on. It's why we have, quote unquote, taken over Venezuela, which we haven't. It's a whole nother set of questions. Anyway, in a quantum political economy, the concept of valorization, the process by which capital expands its values, the whole reason why you have capitalism, you want to capitalize, you're engaged in capitalization. You're expanding value, turning money, as the Marxian equation says, into more money and prime. It's reinterpreted through the lens of quantum mechanics. So we're not reducing it to quantum mechanics, as would some people in terms of econophysics. Rather, we're trying to use this as a way in which we can critique this whole valorization process. Instead of viewing value as a static, linear quantity determined by labor time, this is the labor theory of value element, this framework treats value as, and this is the quantum element, the superposition, as opposed to imposition or whatever, of potential states that only collapses into a realized price. This is an important thing. It is talking about price dynamics and a bunch of other things that is normally not part of the model, or is a way in which you sort of do it in a kind of rudimentary form and then assume that it does that elsewhere in the economy, and that there's no good guarantee that it actually is doing that. So into a realized price upon specific interaction, that is market exchanges. So it is, as today elsewhere, what we're left with all due respect, and I should actually stop here, but what we have is wait a second, is historical materialism. The rest is marketing. Anyway, all we have is historical materialism. Everything else is, as I said, tried to suggest, marketing. So, and as you may have noted, I tend the current state of the way in which I approach things is to sort of use the LLM in multiple iterations of sort of requests or interactions to get it to do things for me that it doesn't do in the first instance. Yeah, it's just laziness that people don't really pursue what LLMs are useful for because its logic is not the same as human logic. It is a different machine type logic that is fine for doing certain types of, search activities, et cetera. But its ability to reason is not quite fully enacted. And as we know, improvements in technology, et cetera, will change that in a very serious way. But anyway, here is the one little end of a thing that I was doing with the LLM. It is important to note that quantum political economy is largely a metaphorical or theoretical framework used by critical theorists. And this quotation, this citation is not a good one, but it's interesting. It's interesting. But I would assert to you that Manuel de Landa is not that germane to what we're looking at. But anyway, um, quantum social theory in effect to describe the quote unquote complexity, volatility, and non-linearity of modern financial capitalism. It's not a literal claim that electrons are moving money. That's the LLM approach to it. People are not atoms, and so therefore you can separate economics from physics, and it's more than sort of a kind of crude division of identity, but it is really much more complex. But rather a way to explain how traditional linear economic models fail to predict, and the prediction thing is where the problem lies for many people. Bubble bursts, flash crashes, and the behavior of algorithmic markets. And unless you think that's unimportant, algorithmic markets are kind of the plastics of of the current state of things. So even as largely a metaphorical or theoretical framework, that's the LLM first cut at this. And we're, as I try and torture the LLM, it's going to go elsewhere. So there are quantitative implications of past explaining predictive failures as examined elsewhere. Now, so the book that, we're currently drawing from and that will affect our ability to model what we're doing and doesn't give us much more time to finish our little thing here, which we may continue next week. We'll see whether it goes that way or not. And that is, the book is called Fictitious Capital: How Finance is Appropriating Our Future by Cedric Durand. Now, this is not that old a book. And of course, it's a left-wing book, blah, blah, blah. It has a left publisher, etc. But it is talking about exactly the same stuff. And this is the kind of thing that goes on in various places in France, whether they, are necessarily talking to each other is a whole different question. And, that's a whole nother thing. So anyway, with respect to that, damn it. Sorry. Let me adjust things here. Damn it. This will take a second. Well, I tried to fix it, but I'm not going to be able to fix it in the way I want to fix it. Towards so the front end here, the book is Cedric Durand's Fictitious Capital: How Finance is Appropriating Our Future. And we begin with the, how do we define fictitious capital? It's accumulation of drawing rights on wealth that is yet to be produced. This is, present value and future assets, which takes the form of private and public indebtedness. So, for example, Trump sees himself as the so-called king of debt. So there's that kind of thing that's going on. Anyway, the front end includes James. I think you should.
Oh,
Can
sorry,
you
I didn't
mute
realize
yourself?
I wasn't muted. I was just thinking King of Debt. Sorry.
King Odette. Anyway, towards cognitive capitalism, say, quote, Deleuze and Guattari, not to withdraw, or, damn, get back to it. Not to withdraw from the process, but to go further to accelerate the process, as Nietzsche put it. So yes, Nietzsche is, it raises a whole variety of other procedural issues that we looked at in past weeks about deconstruction. But the Deleuze and Guattari is still relevant in a variety of ways, and we'll get back to that eventually. But that sort of signals where Durant is working from. So let's read a little bit of this, and then I'll stop. There's a whole bunch else here. The Durant epilogue from his book, and a portion of chapter 3, and a bunch of other things, and that's sort of one element of what we're going to yak about today. But then I got distracted because he quotes from another guy, another French guy, whose new book since the one that Durant is working from kind of pushes the model slightly further, and also he clarifies what he means by certain things, and namely because he does an entire book on the concept of value. He's an economist, but anyway, financialization is no epiphenomenon. It is a process that gets to the very heart of how contemporary capitalism is organized. Indeed, fictitious capital has taken a central place in the general process of capital accumulation. Capital accumulation being, the raison d'etre for capitalists. I mean, it's why they do what they do. Incarnated in debts, shares, and a diverse array of financial products whose weight in our economies has considerably increased. Fictitious capital represents claims over wealth, but wealth that is yet to be produced. And this is this whole thing. It's kind of, to apply it in a much cruder way to a much cruder person. It's kind of what Trump does, what he does. He's constantly staying ahead of the tax man or the bill collectors or whatever. It's just what he does. And he's so psycho that, he obviously stiffs all kinds of folks, and he tries to compensate it by simply robbing other people. It's just it's a massive Ponzi thing. And unless you think that's not what he does, there's a whole pump and dump analysis of current crypto that will show that's exactly what he did. He stole.
Yeah, the crypto scheme is a total. It's a Ponzi scheme. It's a ripoff.
Yes.
It's a total criminal.
Billions of dollars has been stolen from people. The rubes. But anyway, that's another story. Its expansion implies a growing preemption of future production. Fictitious capital's rising power results from substantial transformations in the financial sphere itself, as well as changes that have taken place in its relations with the rest of the social world. This is the introduction to Durant's book. From the production of goods and services to nature, states, and wage labor. So it is comprehensive in that sense. So if finance develops according to a dynamic of its own, that's a whole other set of questions. The hypothesis underpinning this book, that is Durant's book on fictitious capital, holds that the boom of fictitious capital is also the product of unresolved social and economic contradictions. Now that's very Marxian and needs to be unpacked in terms of what is an unresolved economic and social kind. That's the whole means by which we talk about, materialism, dialectical materialism, blah, 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 blah. Why you need to have a revolution, etc. So, as Ferdinand Braudel, the part of the sort of Annales school approach, and which sort of affects or is symptomatic of what Piketty is doing. But anyway, eloquently puts it, financialization is a quote unquote sign of autumn. Now, that's sort of amusing simply because it means the sign of autumn also symbolizes the approach of winter. Anyway, so I've included in this little deal here some of the charts. I love charts, and I love the way that they're ideographically constructed. Even though the LLMs, sometimes do a great job, but mostly do a kind of mechanical job and are often hallucinating. So, but these are not LLM tables. These are done by real people. So, table one, basic categories of fictitious capital in Marx. Marx does describe fictitious capital. And you see the three columns here, expression of revenues resulting from realized accumulation. The second column is investment in future accumulation processes. And third is tradable on the basis of capitalized revenues. So to look at rows here, there's bank credit, no expression of revenue there, but there is investment in future accumulation processes. It's there, but it's not tradable on the basis of capitalized revenues. And so further on, public debt, which public debt is actually the big thing. For example, Trump doesn't understand public debt, which is why he's screwing the entire nation over this, his own personal indulgences. But it's just amazing to me how stupid people have taken control. Company bonds, yes, interest flows, that's kind of the bread and butter. Shares, of course, and we know, of course, that the stock market is not the economy, blah, blah, blah. But it does suggest that what the issue of fictitious capital does reveal itself in the context of shares of stock and flows and blah, 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 all that are part of stock market activity, joint stock companies. And so I put in chapter 6 actually I think I put the whole, well, no, I left out something because he went off on this thing about the 19th century and the origins of stuff. But anyway, let me read a little bit of this, and then I'll skip through the overall structure of where I was headed with this. So, where do financial profits come from? The counterpart to the growth of fictitious capital relative to wealth produced is financial profits increasing share of overall profits. Now, but these financial profits are not themselves fictitious. That's really important. And people get tied up with this about thinking that fictitious is the difference between the literal and the figurative, and it's not quite that. It's just fictitious helps us to describe those things that are, more dynamic. Within this kind of context, the same reason why Steve Keen does his stuff on structural dynamics and stuff. You may be able to visualize it, but it's not quite the same thing, and it never is. But some people like to reduce it that, fictitious, it means it's false. No. It's just simply that it's constantly in motion. That's why the quantum kind of works well with this fictitious thing, because in fact, quantum is described in terms of its physics stuff as spooky action at a distance. And in fact, profits operate in a similar way. So anyway, but back to the story. Paid in hard cash, financial profits, have all the attributes of monetary power. First of all, in terms of what is usually called purchasing power, right? The immediate drawing rights on wealth produced. Their only distinction from other profits is that they have no direct link with the production and exchange of commodities. That's what, they are returns generated by financial process. This is why Marx, this is that problem of Department 1 and Department 2, is that there's this productionist bias, which is important in terms of the 19th century, trade unionism, revolutionary class struggle, and all that sort of stuff. And of course, the shifting and Marx is writing the first volume of Capital from, to front load his argument with commodities, because that's kind of the best way to make it intelligible relative to, you want to think about the use of the Communist Manifesto as a rhetorical device, but the ammunition or the foundation of it is volume one of Capital. And so those who are more interested in the, read the fucking manual, that's kind of what you're supposed to do. Now, the problem is, of course, there's volume two and three and other stuff. And that's changed the nature of the way in which we talk about Marxist stuff in the 21st century. So, without doubt, finance can create favorable conditions for value production by reallocating capital from declining sectors to expanding ones. That's just what it does. Now, this is an essential aspect of finance. Indeed, one to which we will later return. It gets back there in the next chapter. Even so, finance is never itself at the origin of value creation. This raises a whole bunch of other things because our value questions are much more complicated than that. They're just more complicated. We like to think that there's some correlation, price and value and stuff like that. Doesn't quite work that way. And you need to think in much more, greater dimensions or more indeterminacies to try and get that to work. So, for example, financial profits incarnate value, but do not result from value production. So already there's this gap. How is it that we explain this? And that's kind of what Durand's trying to work through, because it puts the fictive or the fiction in fictitious capital. So we should thus then conceive of them as transfers of income away from those activities that produce value. That is, revenues that come from labor. See, we're back to labor theory of value. Labor and our profits drawn from the production of goods and services. So we get back to the normal Department 1, Department 2 thing, but we have to sort of say, oh, there's these transfers are going on. This motion is occurring. And it's not as, it's harder to get a handle on it because we're more obsessed with things that we can sort of actually, feel, touch, whatever, eat. So this poses no simple theoretical question, and its political stakes are of decisive importance. Yes, they are. In identifying the economic source of financial profits is a necessary condition for giving an account of their social content, and ultimately, for thinking through their impact on capitalism's contemporary trajectory. So I've shown this little, this is a diagram that Durand's using it here as talking about the simple cycle of financial instability, but this is built on, Minsky's ideas. And Minsky's always a problem for neoclassical economists because he's thinking about a whole bunch of other different things that are always difficult for neoclassical or Keynesian economists. And it's just, it's really interesting, but of course, problematic if you're, trying to do the Federal Reserve or, do bank stuff.
There's something blocking that top finance. I don't know what that is. I can't see it. It's robust, speculative, and then there's a block.
How's that?
I can't.
I don't. I have no block.
Oh, now I can see it. Ponzi finance. Yeah, there's a little square at the top there. I don't know. It's something you're got going on, but that's okay.
All right. Oh shit.
Ponzi finance.
Yes.
I knew that's kind
of Chuck Ponzi himself.
Yeah.
This is this is important because actually you could argue that much of this is how that we need to articulate the current economy in those kinds of ways, that it is driven by things that still occur. Bernie Madoff, et cetera, you have different versions of finance, right? Robust, speculative Ponzi. And then you have financial crisis, which, happened. It did happen over time. And then you have these other things that are going to be part of the problem. That is, you have expansion, but once you get to this, wherever this break point is, you get debt deflation, and then ultimately, and if this
Right.
gets worse, you get to the depression or a recession. Anyway, and what's related to this, if you're thinking of stock markets, is the quality of securities, so good or bad, and how credit or debt, is counterposed against this little model. Now, this is overly simplified, but it kind of tells you exactly what happens when the instability occurs. Now, another way to
Yeah.
look at this is also built on Minsky, that Duran is building on Minsky, and it's a circular version of that as opposed to a linear version of that. And we can model it that way too. Growing competition, optimism, recovery, small crises, lower quality credit, protracted expansion, amplified systemic risk, and structural crisis. All that's there. That's fine. It's just a different way of looking at the triangle above. But in some ways, with all due respect to ideographic, thinking about these things, visualizing it, is that that's also inadequate. We have to get back or go to the things that I was talking about before last week, the millefeuille. That is, you need to think of these as multiple levels of things. Describe exactly what goes on in capitalism. That is, we have interventions, there are public interventions in that little triangular thing we were looking at. And this other little thing, figure 7, probably more important for this particular chapter, is to describe the things that were going on above as in this vertical way. That is, from excessive credit to overinvestment. And Duran spends a little bit of time on this because it's a semantic difference. That is, questions of underconsumption, overproduction, and then to, juxtapose it to financialization is under and overinvestment. And what he does in this particular chapter is talk about a guy who's really important for more conservative right-wing economics, and that is Hayek, who is fully ensconced in the methodological individualism that we were critiquing in prior weeks. And so Hayek is not really, he's a guy that they worship over there in, the American Enterprise Institute, et cetera, George Mason University. But it's problematic for all the obvious reasons. There's no such thing as a free market, for example, and you can't build a model of free enterprise on top of that. So anyway, there are other examples, and there's a table that shows historically that Duran is constructing. This is from Carlotta Perez's article. Interesting article. I mean, it has other issues, but it's just an interesting article. The way to think about it, because there's bunches of these arguments about how the modern economy has been built from the Industrial Revolution, and we were looking at a year or so ago at Brad DeLong's stuff to try and get a handle on these different waves, as it were, of history or of technology. And the problem is, of course, that do you reduce it to the technology? Do you do other things? And there's ways in which we talk about it that aren't, obvious, that are not as obvious to us as we may think. So, for example, the Roaring '20s was, a roaring period, but there are people who, were in terrible shape. And so, this is the age of gangsterism, et cetera. So the roaring describes a whole bunch of other things. So, needless to say, the periodic view of golden ages would be the first British leap in 1771, the steam engine, blah, 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 and the Victorian boom in 1848 to 50, which is formative, obviously, in terms of railway mania, which is, Marx is fully engaged in this at the same time there are revolutions, right? And then the Belle Epoque, the progressive era happened at the same time, which is an interesting way in which you think about global market infrastructure buildup. But on the other hand, you could talk about Paris and Cezanne or whatever, and that's actually part of the same set of issues when you think of it more seriously. Um, anyway, so yes, and so the last golden age, of course, is the 1950s, and this is the question that's being raised by some people. The emerging markets.com and internet mania, financial casino, and the turning point recession was in 2007. And yes, there is a question mark there because, we may still be in the damn thing. But it is symptomatic, as we know, and which we've been, anxious about, is an information and computer technology revolution led by the U.S. and in which our little pod, we've been reading about it, variations on it in the context of Palo Alto. So anyway, so I included that and got to the little lesson for this does occur. Oh God. Well, there's a paper on that and on the rentier's revenge. So I did a thing here to a little digression, which would be normally a note about the revenge of the market on the rentiers, why neoliberal reports of the end of history, what's his name, turned out to be premature. The rentiers would receive no real income, but as interest rates on money in nominal terms are adjusted for inflation, the real value of their existing money holdings is intact. So there's already a divergence in value, as it were. And so the real value of their existing money holdings is intact. So this is like playing a bluff. This is kind of what Trump does. So although rentiers did succeed in their attempt to get rid of practically all fetters on their greed, in the end, the crisis materialized when the markets took their inevitable revenge on the rentiers by calling their blatant bluff. This is what's going on in Russia right now, is people, don't know what's happening with their money, and they're beginning to get nervous. So anyway, there's another side paper, and then I put that in here because it's actually quite good in terms of talking about this rentier problem. So starting from this is from the abstract. Starting from the perspective of heterodox Keynesian, Minskian, Kindlebergian financial, Charles Kindleberger talks about crises, the panics and stuff. It's sort of the master the magisterial work on financial crisis. And anyway, this particular paper, it's I don't know if I should open it up, but anyway, begins by highlighting a number of mechanisms that contributed to that is the 2007 financial crisis, 2007, 2008. And these include, yes, and things that Durand gets back to as well: liquidity, income polarization, conflicts between financial and capital and productive capital, lack of intelligent regulation. Well, that just comes with the territory in the United States. Asymmetric information, that's sort of standard. It's why it's why I get nervous every time I have to buy a car. But anyway, principal agent dilemmas and bounded rationalities. That's all, people gotten their Nobel Prizes over these things. So the paper then proceeds to argue that perhaps more than ever, the macroeconomics that led to the crisis only makes analytical sense if examined within the framework of the political settlements and distributional outcomes in which it had operated. So, it's important to look. This is Michael Hudson stuff. You look at exactly what happened, when it happened, in its timetable. So, taking the perspective of critical social theories, the paper concludes that ultimately, the current financial crisis is the outcome of something much more systemic. Namely, and this is where this is political, an attempt to use neoliberal, or in US terms, neoconservatism, as a technology of power to help transform capitalism into a rentier's delight. The fact is that's what's happening. That's why Trump thinks he can build, ballrooms and shit like that. Anyway, so that was a digression, but it helped fill out the rentier element of this discussion. We're still back in Durand here. page 55, the price of financial assets is disputed between two poles. That is, the autonomous dynamic of speculation and a loose but necessary relation with their fundamental value. So this is that value thing we're having trouble with because it wasn't as palpable as we wanted it. So, however, the speculative logic is not the equivalent of the fundamental logic. While the former, that is speculative logic, is elaborated in the game of mirrors of financial subjectivities, the latter, it's why you read Andrew Ross Sorkin. The mirrors of financial subjectivities is what, that's why you watch CNBC or whatever. The latter has an underlying existence of its own, which agents must always maintain a grip on. And so he comes, Durand is building from a book, Le Pouvoir de la Finance of 1999 by André Orléans. But there's a new book, and it clarifies it differently. Well, it's not that different, and it doesn't contradict where Durand is headed. But Orléans has a newer book, and it's translated from whatever. It's more the problems of translation. But Orléans' book is A New Foundation for Economics, 2014, and he's without going through. This is from that book, the introduction, and he explains why he's doing what he's doing, and it is what he was doing before. That is critiquing marginalism. And marginalism is the basis under which we do neoclassical economics, the basis under which many people, it's how the Fed operates, et cetera. They assume certain marginalist ideas that the actual economists in the Fed sometimes don't really agree with, and they do all kinds of other stuff, but they know their job is to do the marginalist stuff. So it's always interesting to read Fed documents because they do both things, because they're a research organization as well as a bank. Marginalist theory holds that the value of a commodity derives from its utility. Utility theory underlies the neoclassical model. This idea lies at the root of modern economic thought. Value, this is that problem of value that we looked at above. Value is considered to be a quantity or magnitude that exists separately. This is the real problem of neoclassical economics, from the activity of exchange, which is really the key element here. And it always is. It's what Marx talks about. And it's ignored because it's just uglier. It's more problematic in terms of getting your math to work or whatever. And the fact that it is ugly, it's why there's this divergence between orthodox and heterodox economics analysis. So, in the form of a property, or as the classical economists called it, a quote unquote substance. Now, the use of the word substance is important here because this goes back to Rick Wolf's critique of essentialism because before we looked at this little thing where there's Rick Wolf and Resnick's work on comparing classical Keynesian and Marxian economics. Anyway, so value is considered to be a quantity or magnitude that exists separately from the value of the activity of exchange in the form of a property, or as the classical economists called a substance, that is peculiar to commodities, namely their usefulness. Now, if we're going to look at you could look at commodities in this context from a quantum angle. That's just, there's not a lot of research done, and there should be, but we're just not there yet. I assume at some moment in the future, in the next decade, there will be armies of graduate students working on the problem relative to commodities. But anyway, that's another story. Neoclassical economists hold that the search for useful goods is the force that animates market economies, and that the need to satisfy the demand of consumers for useful goods. You see, this is that Department 2 kind of bias that it's just consumer markets are more important than production markets because that we buy stuff. The buying of stuff was really more important at the turn of the 19th and 20th centuries. You had this burgeoning middle class, all this other people had more money, or at least more debt, and stuff happened. So Useful goods is a source of both production and exchange. This conception of value finds its most complete expression in Walrasian general equilibrium theory. And without going a whole hog on the equilibrium theory stuff, so this guy has decided to say, well, I refuse to accept that economic value can be identified with a property, whether utility or any other, that pre-exists exchange. So this is that thing I began with. It's not as palpable. It is more about the interaction. We looked at this when I was talking about the logic of that Rick Wolf was talking about, that the logic for Marxism is different. It's just different. It's not less. It's just, in fact, it's much more complicated. But it is important to think of it that way because, in fact, that's what exchange is built on, is, movement back and forth. So it must be considered instead as something which is uniquely the product of market relations, which gets us back to my little comment on historical materialism. The rest is marketing. But anyway, through which the commercial sphere itself attains a separate existence, independent of other social activities. So this is where neoclassicism fails, is because it gets all the math to work, but it forgets about everything else, which are much more problematic. Culture, nature, that's with neoclassicism. You can use the analysis, of course, to analyze culture and nature. My favorite examples are the economics journals that every couple of years somebody does a paper on dope, on marijuana. And so you get that thing that appears in major journals that is this weird application of neoclassical economics to the dope market or to the market for art. And those are all quite fascinating, but they're kind of meaningless because they're really interesting little arguments and a lot of math and stuff, but it doesn't quite answer much larger questions about the whole complexity of markets, et cetera, et cetera. They don't want to do that. They just deal with it. Oh, well, I can plug all these equations in and it kind of looks nice and it works. And you can make judgments about it, about the difference in terms of long range value of why is it that people hold on to artwork and blah, 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 blah. Anyway, the value created by market relations is not meant to satisfy the desires of customers, but to infinitely expand the domination of commodities. So it's more about domination than it is about the things themselves. So it is possible, indeed, in some cases demonstrable, that the demand for utility plays a role in this connection, but where utility enters into the act of valuation, it does so only as one element among others. So this is where that problem occurs, and it is about the market. So market relations encompass a range of human impulses, not the least of which is the quest for prestige. That's Trump in a sentence. He's just all about the prestige. And he doesn't give a shit about anything else. And of course, it's narcissistic prestige, which makes it even worse. So conflicts over social position, no less than the urge to acquire useful goods, whatever that means, arise from a certain relationship to objects. This is, you want to analyze Trump, why does he like gold so much? And his interest or reasons is totally perverse, but he never talks about it, of course, which is really also interesting for another set of reasons. Anyway, it's why he stole the Club World Cup trophy from the winning team. Anyway, more generally, value in many situations is sought after for its own sake, insofar as it represents a universal purchasing power. My purpose, then, is to show that market value is an autonomous phenomenon that cannot be reduced to any pre-existing magnitude, such as utility, labor, or scarcity. So the point of all this is to show that he's still opposing a neoclassical model and is still critiquing all of their basic elements. Now, labor, of course, is equally problematic for a variety of other reasons. So anyway, I'm going to skip towards the end here because he talks about Zimmel and a bunch of other stuff. So the assertion of objective financial value cannot be sustained. And so this gets us back to the financialization stuff. The underlying logic of this whole business here that I put in is a digression, of course, but it is the more later version of the same author's work. So the underlying logic of such markets is essentially mimetic. It matters little or not at all what each actor personally thinks a particular share is worth. What counts in a market is being able to predict what the majority opinion of its value would turn out to be. Now, this is exactly what we're trying to do with quantum stuff, is that we don't really know what it is. And that's why it's all probabilistic, really difficult. And it has these elements to it that make it even more difficult. But, if you're a neoclassicist, you say, well, we have the linear model and we can get the differentials to blah, blah, blah. And, it's much more complicated than that. This imitative dynamic, this gets back to the mimesis. They use the word mimesis, is the source of misalignment that is sometimes observed between prices in the real economy and in financial markets. See, he's still addressing the crux of the problem, is that you have a real economy and then this other thing, which on the one hand operates autonomously, but also screws up everything else, and that is, financial stuff. So Andre Orleans, A New Foundation for Economics, 2014. So to give the close of the introduction, the need to give economics a new and more secure foundation nevertheless goes well beyond the circumstances and events of the present moment. Indeed, looking to the future, it is an absolute necessity if modern societies are to understand how and why they are as they are, in the hope of ensuring their own survival. So ultimately, he's saying this pretty important stuff. So there's that digression from Durand. And then we're back to Durand, where he's talking about the more fundamental issues that we're going to get to. I thought I put that in because Orleans really, there was a decade, 15 years between that book and the original book that Durand's using. So to me, that's kind of interesting to have that there, because he doesn't really change his mind. He just has a lot more ways to talk about value, which I found useful and will be useful when I do the next thing. So this is back to Durand. The process of valorization, I'm at the end of my time. The process of valorization through social production overdetermines the process of financial valorization. Now, that overdetermined thing goes back to what Rick Wolf is talking about. This is the problem that the math doesn't match up, because you have over and under determination and a bunch of other things that make it very difficult to talk about how things get valorized. So in other words, speculative valorization and fundamental valorization are not symmetrical. This is what I was talking about at the beginning, about asymmetry between, in these things. For while speculation does necessarily refer to the process of valorization production, the inverse is not the case. So this is where it becomes difficult. On the one hand, if you're a Marxist, you want to say, well, you should be able to deal with all of this as a dynamic. But the fact is, it never fully comes to rest, which is the limitation of using equilibrium theory, is it just doesn't do it. You get equilibrium, but it's more static, however you want to describe that. It appears static, but is really more dynamic, which is the whole issue of equilibrium, particularly if you're applying equilibrium theory to other things like chemistry or whatever, or biology. And that's the point that Bellamy Foster is making about certain ideas about science that are changed in the 19th century, and why Engels was so interested in that stuff. Anyway, yet that is the very thing that the financial community tries to achieve by way of liquidity. So ultimately, we're already back to the same problem. That is, the problem of the 2007-2008 financial crisis was a liquidity problem. And so this is why one needs to have a better idea about how these things operate. The liquidity that the financial markets work to organize has the objective of ensuring that the bets that investors make on the future valorization process can constantly be transformed into immediately available value. So this is ultimately where the contradictions occurs. However, this is the point. This ambition runs up against a fallacy. The logical fallacy, the fallacy of composition, is one of 400 or 40 or whatever different fallacies, logical fallacies. But anyway, that's another story. Even if each individual actor can offload the security he holds, that cannot be true of all investors all at once. This is why you have panics. This is why stuff can get really screwed up. This is kind of what will happen to Russia in another couple of months if things don't work out right. So Keynes clearly demonstrated this point, stating that there is no such thing as liquidity of investment for the community as a whole. So what Keynes was trying to say is that, you can talk about liquidity, you can analyze the problems of it, the Keynesian liquidity trap, blah, blah, blah. But the fact of the matter is, you can't fix it that way. You can get to intermediate solutions, and that's why military Keynesianism looks the way it does, is because it does generate all this other stuff. But ultimately, pipers have to be paid. Simple explanation for this: the productive capital has been invested in the relations of indebtedness that underlie financial securities do not represent immediately available value. This is that distance between present and future, right? We were talking about before. They are promises. This is important. A promise, to use the linguistic example, get back to semiotics, a promise is a speech act. It is not just simply a declarative, there's something else going on in a promise. To give you a more radical example, of course, is taking an oath or getting married. Those are performative. The vows you make as in a marriage are promises. So in that sense, that they are performative in that sense. And so and without getting into the whole theory of that, but that's an important element of talking about this in these ways. So it is only possible to solve them if someone else agrees to take them over. Now, the additional proviso you want to ask here is they may agree to take them over, but maybe they're lying to you, which is kind of Trumpian, brand. So what Orlean calls the paradox of liquidity starkly underlies the relative character of finance's autonomy. See, you can argue that well, everything is really more productive and that finance just operates separately, and it doesn't really affect us that much until certain other things happen. So he uncovers the tension, and this is the point of all of that arm waving, the difference between the process of real valorization and the process of financial valorization, a tension at the heart of the questions raised by financialization. And fictitious capital is the way, as you can see in the sentence here, fictitious capital is the most adequate concept for dealing with this difficult problem. So, and then he goes through a whole thing in here, talks about why I got purged from Palgrave, which is the big dictionary, and then there's a whole thing he does, and which I skipped for the most part. Although I found a great rap video about Keynes versus Hayek, which is kind of amusing, the Austrian school. But anyway, and I actually wrote a thing over in Coast about that. But the next thing is Marx and or Jenkinson front end of some of these kinds of discussions about fictitious capital, and so he does a thing on that. I guess I'm already out of time. So the point I want to make to try and get us to our kind of closing moment here is, damn it, Scheist. There is a problem that Marx identifies, that is the ambivalence of the forms of anticipating capital valorization. And so, and Durand sort of suggests that, well, Hayek said this, and Marx, he never read any Marx, apparently. So that's a whole nother story. And so there's no way of talking about the connections, on the other hand, it is this gap that is actually really important to us. So there is a discussion here in which Marx gives us a kind of critique of this valorization problem that Hayek doesn't fully address. And so the important element that comes from this is this ambivalence, or this variability or uncertainty or indeterminacy that exists. And of course, it has other implications that include fetishizing, etc. I put in the epilogue, and it talks a little bit about other ways in which you can talk about the problems and the differences among. And this is important for the stuff I'm doing, is to try and identify the different logics that underlie the accumulation of fictitious capital, because then once you figure out the different logics, you can see where they overlap or don't overlap, and how that solves our original problem that we started with, and was those multiple layers at the front end. And that gets us to what I was talking about last week, and in terms of catastrophes and the millefeuille, that is the dessert. So that's where I was last week, and there's other things in here. I asked a couple of questions from the LLM about this to try and work through that, and it kind of hallucinated for a little bit. So I need to get back and sort of work through this. But it is interesting because it raises certain questions about what counts as productive capital. Most people think, rent is something that's collected by landlords and they sit on their asses and blah, blah, blah. That's not really quite how rent operates. And so one needs to think about how it, as an asset form, tangible or intangible, operate. And so And lest you think that's important, it has everything to do with the question of how we think about property, and of course affects a variety of industries, including software, intellectual property rights, etc. And so it's no different to talk about them in that way. And people need to get past, sort of the Ricardian, the David Ricardo constraints on that set of ideas, and address newer ways that engage the quantum sort of issues. So I included some of that. I let the LLM hallucinate about this because it sort of did. But I'm going to work through this, and I'll probably write something. Because it was interesting to me, and it's kind of the thing I'm working on, is how is it that, virtually speaking, we can connect all of these different capital forms and actually make sense of it? Because I think it does. It's more acute in the urban context because you can actually see where they run up against each other, and because they don't run up against each other in the rural context. But that's why urban economics is kind of useful in that particular sense. I was talking about that before in terms of air rights, development rights. So and so the legal system is really important. And obviously I went yammering on here. I included an article from that talks a little bit about, and this is kind of important, about the difference in, for example, Chinese money. And then another thing on, well, it has to do with the way in which dollar accumulation and reserves operate. And that's kind of where we're kind of heading to. So, and then, of course, I included another review, and this gets us back to the algorithm question relative to hallucinating LLMs. Artificial Communication, How Algorithms Produce Social Intelligence, by Elena Esposito. And so the LLM pointed out this particular ebook. It's free, so look at it yourself. I mean, there's other issues, engagement, but for me, it was really important because she gives us a sense of how we can better think of how to deal with LLMs. And it's not artificial intelligence, but it is communication. And so it raises some interesting questions about theories, among other things. And if anything, it's the machines that have to make sure with some version of CAPTCHA that their interlocutors are people. These are these underlying test questions, Turing models and stuff. That's kind of really important. And so, and she raises the more critical or acute areas, and the ones that I'm sort of amused by, is in pursuing the goal of algorithmic justice. Then the most important problems are communicative, not cognitive. And this is, she's addressing this kind of question where we get too afraid of these things. But on the other hand, bad lawyers get lazy about using AI. And then, of course, there's other side amusements. You may want to look at my little conversation I had with an LLM because I was comparing two films, Die Hard, 1981, right, or 88, whatever. And The Detective, which is a Frank Sinatra film in 1968. And it's interesting only because, and from a trivia point of view, is that Die Hard is sort of technically, and this is my argument with, or my conversation with the LLM, is that Die Hard is sort of the sequel to The Detective, because in the history of Die Hard, Frank Sinatra was 70 when Die Hard was being produced, and there was some contractual obligation that, in some ways, he had right of first refusal, I suppose, uh, to whether they were going to do it, using the same characters. And so Frank Sinatra would have been in Die Hard, but obviously, as we see, because of directors and writers and suits and other stuff, it became a very different kind of film, rather than a gritty discussion of gay New York. This is bombing skyscrapers in LA. And I'll close with this. There's an interesting set of questions underlying the architecture of 2008. Why it's a little interesting article because it addresses the question without asking quantum questions. But then I had the LLM sort of study it a little bit, and it sort of came up with some useful, its own hallucinations about it. But it sort of said, this is the right direction. The second derivative, why no one understands the AI boom. And so there's a whole other set of things. And I had the LLM sort of fiddle with that, but it still needs to be worked on. So anyway, I got to the end. Thank you very much. I went over time. I will, of course, I can entertain questions, I suppose. I